The flower market at Covent Garden stirred to life in that peculiar hour before true dawn, when London existed in shades of pewter and smoke, and the gaslight still burned against the autumn darkness like uncertain promises. The air hung heavy with moisture, that persistent drizzle which was neither rain nor mist but something in between, coating the cobblestones with a treacherous sheen and clinging to wool and silk alike with indiscriminate dampness. Among the weathered carts and makeshift stalls, where rough-handed men arranged chrysanthemums and dahlias with surprising tenderness, there stood a figure so incongruous she might have been a ghost from another world entirely, Lady Isadora Winthrop, though none who passed her now would know that name or the weight it once carried in London's most elegant ballrooms. Her hands, which had once worn gloves of the finest kid leather and touched nothing more troublesome than ivory fan sticks and crystal champagne flutes, now arranged roses with practiced efficiency, the thorns having long since taught her fingers where to grip and where to yield. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that had seen far better days, its hem muddied beyond redemption, its bodice mended so many times. The original stitching had become merely a suggestion beneath her careful repairs, yet she wore it as though it were still the height of fashion, her spine straight, her chin lifted with that particular grace that no amount of poverty could quite extinguish. The grey sky wept its cold tears upon her dark hair, once dressed by ladies' maids and adorned with ostrich plumes, now pinned simply at the nape of her neck with whatever pins she could spare. 2 years had passed since her father's disgrace, Lord Winthrop's name, now spoken only in whispers, associated with financial scandal, ruinous investments, and the betrayal of a dozen families who had trusted him with their fortunes. And in those 2 years, Isadora had learned what it meant to fall from the heights of society into the depths where no one caught you, where former friends crossed streets to avoid acknowledgement, where invitations ceased and doors closed with finality that echoed like coffin lids. Her mother had not survived the shock. Consumption had claimed her within 6 months of their disgrace, though Isadora suspected it was truly shame that had stolen her final breaths. Now there was only this: the flower cart she rented for 6pence daily, the roses she purchased before dawn from the wholesale merchants, the careful calculations of profit, measured in shillings and pence, that meant the difference between her rented room and the workhouse. She arranged the blooms with an artist's eye, creating compositions of cream and crimson, blush and burgundy, because even here, especially here, beauty mattered. Perhaps it was all that remained of who she had been. This insistence that something lovely could exist even in desperate circumstances. The market awakened fully around her as the grey light strengthened, voices calling prices and greetings, the smell of coffee from a nearby vendor mixing with the green scent of stems and earth, and Isadora stood among her roses like a fallen angel, tending a garden she could never again enter, waiting for customers who might spare a few coins for beauty they would carry into lives she would never know. Sebastian Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ashford, had not intended to pass through Covent Garden that morning, but his meeting with his solicitors had concluded earlier than anticipated, and he found himself with that rarest of commodities unscheduled time, and so he had dismissed his carriage and chosen to walk, seeking perhaps some momentary reprieve from the calculated precision that governed every other aspect of his existence. He was a man whom society regarded with equal measures of respect and wariness, his title ancient and unimpeachable, his fortune substantial, his reputation for cold rationality legendary in the clubs and drawing rooms, where men spoke of business and women whispered of his conspicuous lack of romantic entanglements. At 32, he had perfected the art of emotional distance, conducting his affairs financial, social, and the rare physical encounters he permitted himself with the same detached efficiency one might apply to reviewing ledgers, and if there was something lonely in this existence, something hollow, he had long since convinced himself that loneliness was preferable to the alternative his parents' marriage had demonstrated with such brutal clarity. The flower market interested him only as a point of passage, a splash of color in the grey morning, until he saw her, the woman at the rose cart, whose posture alone arrested his attention, for he had spent enough time among the aristocracy to recognize true breeding when he encountered it. And this woman, despite her circumstances, which were evident in her worn clothing, and the calluses he glimpsed upon her hands, carried herself with a dignity that belonged to ballrooms rather than market stalls. He approached, observing details with the same acute attention he applied to potential investments. The precision of her flower arrangements, the cleanliness of her person despite obvious poverty, and the way her eyes, remarkable eyes, grey as the morning itself, met his without either the false boldness of solicitation or the cringing deference he might have expected. "Your roses," he said, his voice carrying the clipped formality that had become his natural mode of speech. "They are exceptionally fine." She inclined her head with a grace that stirred something in his memory, though he could not immediately place it. "You are kind to say so, sir. They are freshly cut this morning. Would you care to purchase one?" Her voice confirmed what her bearing had suggested. This was no common flower girl, but someone who had known better circumstances, and Sebastian found himself unaccountably curious about the trajectory that had brought her to this place. "A single stem," he replied, selecting a cream-colored bloom of particular perfection. Their fingers did not touch as she wrapped it in paper, but he was aware of her nonetheless, of the contradiction she represented, of the way she treated this transaction with the same courtesy she might have applied to far grander exchanges. He paid her twice what she asked, and when she began to protest, he silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. "For the quality," he said simply, and took his rose, and walked away feeling strangely unsettled, though he could not have articulated why. He did not recognize her, not then, but something in her face lingered in his thoughts throughout the day, a puzzle his mind worried at even as he conducted his business. And that night, alone in his study, he found himself studying the rose he had placed in a crystal vase, wondering about the woman who had sold it to him with such quiet dignity, and experiencing the unfamiliar sensation of wanting to know more. Isadora's days had acquired the rhythm of necessity, that particular cadence which poverty imposes upon those unaccustomed to its demands, and she rose each morning in darkness 4:30 by the cracked porcelain clock in her rented room to make her way through streets still populated by night's final stragglers to the wholesale market, where she purchased her roses, selecting each stem with the critical eye her mother had once applied to choosing fabrics for ball gowns, rejecting any bloom that showed the slightest imperfection, for she had learned that her customers, though they might not consciously recognize quality, responded to it nonetheless, and quality was the only advantage she possessed over the dozen other flower sellers who competed for the same coins. By 6 o'clock she was at her cart, arranging the roses into displays that caught what little light the grey autumn mornings offered, and she remained there until dusk claimed the market, her feet aching in boots that needed resoling, her hands chapped despite the salve she made from stolen moments and cheaper ingredients, speaking to customers with the same courtesy she had once employed in drawing rooms, never allowing her voice to rise in the common hawker's cry, never permitting desperation to show in her demeanor, for dignity, her mother had taught her, was not contingent upon circumstance, but upon choice. One could choose to maintain standards, even when the world conspired to strip them away. The other vendors had regarded her with suspicion initially, this incongruous gentlewoman in their midst, but time and genuine kindness had softened their reserve, and now she counted among her friends Mrs. Davison, who sold violets and spoke with rough affection, and old Tom, whose chrysanthemums occupied the neighboring cart, and who had more than once shared his lunch when Isadora's coins had run too short, and the pie-seller's daughter Mary, who dreamed of a position in a great house, and asked Isadora endless questions about the world she had lost, questions Isadora answered with patience, though each one was a small knife to her heart, reminding her of what she had been. Her room, reached by 4 flights of narrow stairs in a building that sagged with age and housed a dozen other souls in similar straits, measured perhaps 10 feet square and contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a trunk that held what remained of her former life. 2 other dresses, her mother's pearl earrings which she could not bear to sell, a miniature portrait of her parents in happier times, and a pressed rose from her coming-out ball when she had worn white silk and danced with a dozen suitors and believed the world was full of endless promise. She kept this room as she kept herself, scrupulously clean despite the building's pervasive grime. The single window washed weekly, her few possessions arranged with care, maintaining the standards her upbringing had instilled, because to let them slip would be to surrender the last bastion of who she had been, and she had sworn at her mother's grave that she would not beg, would not compromise her principles. would not seek rescue through the only means available to beautiful, destitute women, would instead endure whatever hardship necessary to preserve some essential core of self that poverty could not purchase and shame could not claim, though there were nights when exhaustion and despair whispered seductive arguments for surrender, and she had to remind herself why dignity mattered, had to hear her mother's voice speaking across the barrier of death, telling her that circumstances were temporary but character was eternal, and so she rose each morning and arranged her roses and maintained her standards and waited, though for what she could not have said, for some change in fortune that reason told her would never arrive. The next morning Sebastian returned, and the morning after that, and in the days that followed his appearances acquired the regularity of a habit, though he told himself it was merely convenience, that the route through Covent Garden suited his schedule, that the roses were of exceptional quality, and his household required fresh flowers, excuses that grew increasingly transparent even to his own rigorous self-examination. As the weeks passed and autumn deepened into November's chill, he purchased a single rose each time, always selecting the bloom himself with deliberate care, their exchanges remaining formal, yet developing a tenor of familiarity. She learned to have a cream or blush-colored specimen set aside for his inspection. He began timing his arrivals to the quieter morning hours when her cart was less crowded, and their brief conversations need not be hurried by other customers' impatience. They spoke of inconsequential matters, the weather, the quality of the season's blooms, the small dramas of the marketplace, yet Sebastian found himself listening not merely to her words, but to the intelligence behind them, the education evident in her vocabulary, the breeding that shaped her syntax, and he observed details that his business acumen had trained him to notice: the way her hands trembled slightly on the coldest mornings, the increasing thinness of her face as winter's hardship mounted, the fact that her coat, though meticulously maintained, was wholly inadequate for the season's demands. He fought against the interest she provoked, reminding himself that curiosity was the first breach in walls he had spent years constructing, and that his father's violence and his mother's suffering had taught him that emotional engagement led only to pain, that the cold precision with which he conducted his life was not emptiness but protection, yet still he returned, drawn by something he would not name, troubled by the contradiction of her circumstances and her dignity, by the mystery of how she had arrived at this particular desperation. His inquiries, conducted with the discretion his position and resources made possible, had yielded her identity within a fortnight. Lady Isadora Winthrop, daughter of the late Earl of Pembury, whose financial crimes and subsequent suicide had scandalized society 3 years prior. A young woman who had been engaged to Lord Edmund Pierce before her family's ruin, and who had subsequently vanished from society's view, presumed to have sought refuge with distant relations, or perhaps worse fates that drawing rooms discussed in whispers. Knowing her story only deepened the enigma she represented, for she had clearly chosen this hard independence over the alternatives available to beautiful, desperate women, had maintained some essential core of self that poverty had not corrupted, and Sebastian found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion that he eventually, reluctantly, identified as admiration. Though admiration was dangerous, was the beginning of regard, and regard led to attachment, and attachment was the very thing he had vowed never to permit. Isadora, for her part, noticed his consistency without ascribing significance to it beyond gratitude, assuming him to be simply a kind gentleman of regular habits who appreciated quality and who perhaps, in his formal courtesy, recognized something of breeding in her despite her fallen circumstances, and she treated him with the same dignified professionalism she offered all her customers, never permitting herself to wonder about his life beyond their brief exchanges, never acknowledging even to herself that she had begun listening for his footsteps, that his arrivals had become the day's singular bright moment in hours otherwise, characterized by cold and weariness and the slow erosion of hope, for to acknowledge such things would be to admit a dependence she could not afford. And so the weeks passed with their careful dance of approach and restraint, neither speaking what both had begun, in their different ways, to feel. December arrived with a cruelty particular to London winters, the cold possessing a damp, penetrating quality that no amount of layering could fully repel. And on a morning when frost silvered the cobblestones, and Isadora's breath emerged in visible clouds, Sebastian appeared at her cart before the market had properly awakened, the sky still holding night's darkness at its edges, and without preamble or greeting, he gestured to her entire display and said quietly, "I should like to purchase them all." Isadora stared at him, in confusion, rendering her momentarily speechless, for she had perhaps 36 roses arranged across her cart, far more than any single household could reasonably require, and when she found her voice she said carefully, "All of them, sir." And he nodded once, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom, adding, "Every stem, if you please, and the cart may be collected later." She began wrapping the roses with hands that trembled from more than cold, her mind calculating the sum with a hope that felt dangerous, for this single transaction would cover nearly a month's rent, would allow her to purchase a proper winter coat, would provide a cushion against the grinding daily terror of destitution. Yet even as she worked, she felt the strangeness of the gesture, the excess that suggested motivation beyond mere need for flowers, and when she had wrapped the final bundle and named her price fairly, though her desperation urged inflation, he paid without hesitation and then remained standing before her cart, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her chapped hands, her threadbare gloves, the coat that hung too loosely on her frame. "Lady Isadora Winthrop," he said, and the use of her full name struck her like a physical blow, for no one in this marketplace knew her title, knew her history, and she felt exposure wash over her like ice water as he continued, "I am Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashford, and I have a proposal of a practical nature which I believe may prove mutually beneficial." The formal words seemed to cost him something, a tension visible in his jaw, and Isadora found herself unable to respond, unable to reconcile this revelation that her kind and consistent customer was a duke, was precisely the sort of man before whom she had once curtsied in ballrooms, with the growing warmth she had been so carefully not acknowledging, and into her silence he spoke with the tone of a man conducting business negotiations, laying out terms for a transaction rather than a life. "I require a duchess for social obligations my position demands, someone capable of managing a great household and representing my family in society. You require security, respectability, and escape from circumstances that will likely prove fatal before spring concludes. I propose a marriage of arrangement, a practical alliance with clearly defined expectations. You would have your own chambers, an allowance, freedom to pursue your interests within the bounds of propriety, and I would ask only that you fulfill the public duties of your position with competence. There would be no expectations of affection, no pretense of sentiment that neither of us requires, merely a civilized partnership addressing our respective needs." He delivered this extraordinary proposal with the same measured calm he might employ discussing investments, yet Isadora saw something flicker behind his eyes, some emotion quickly suppressed, and she felt the world tilt beneath her feet, pride roaring its outrage that she should be offered such cold charity, that he should stand before her with pity disguised as pragmatism, that 3 years of maintaining her dignity should culminate in this, a business proposition delivered in a frost-covered marketplace, while simultaneously her exhausted, desperate body whispered its seduction, warmth, safety, food, rest, survival, all the things she had been slowly losing in her fight to preserve principles that no one witnessed or rewarded, and she heard herself say, voice barely above a whisper, "I require time to consider," and he nodded as though he had expected nothing less, replying, "Until tomorrow morning, then," and walked away into the gathering dawn, leaving her standing beside her empty cart with the weight of an impossible choice settling onto shoulders already bowed by 3 years of bearing what she had believed to be the full measure of hardship fate could devise. The day that followed proved the longest of Isadora's life, each hour stretching with the weight of a decision that would determine not merely her immediate future, but the entire shape of her remaining years, and she moved through her market routine mechanically, her hands arranging flowers, while her mind circled endlessly around the Duke's extraordinary proposal, examining it from every angle as one might study a jewel for flaws, searching for the hidden cost that such offers always carried. Her friends in the market, Sally, who sold apples, old Thomas with his meat pies, Martha, whose herb bundles scented the morning air, noticed her distraction and extracted the story with gentle persistence, and their reactions proved unanimously pragmatic. "Marry him," they urged. "For God's sake, marry him before he changes his mind. What is pride when measured against survival? What is dignity worth? If you freeze to death, maintaining it." And Sally gripped her hands with rough affection and said, "You think we don't see you getting thinner each week? You think we don't know that coat won't last January? Take the safety he's offering, girl. Take it, and don't look back with regrets." Yet still Isadora hesitated, not from any romantic notion that she deserved love. 3 years of hardship had thoroughly cured her of such fancies, but from a bone-deep resistance to becoming any man's obligation, any man's charitable project, a resistance rooted in the final shreds of pride that poverty had not yet managed to strip away. She returned to her small room as evening fell, climbed the narrow stairs past peeling wallpaper and the smell of boiled cabbage, entered the space that was barely large enough for her cot and single chair, and sat in darkness as night deepened beyond her window, remembering her mother who had died 6 months before her father's exposure, who had perhaps known what was coming and chosen escape through illness, who had gripped Isadora's hand in those final days and whispered, "Courage is not always loud, my darling. Sometimes it is simply the quiet decision to continue, to adapt, to survive with whatever grace we can muster in circumstances that offer no graceful options." Words that Isadora had carried through every degradation of her fall from society to street vendor, words that returned now with the force of guidance from beyond the grave. She thought of Sebastian's dark eyes holding something unspoken beneath their careful formality, thought of his consistent kindness over the weeks of his visits, thought of how he had framed his proposal not as rescue but as mutual benefit, granting her the dignity of believing herself useful rather than merely pitied. And she wondered if perhaps this arrangement might prove not imprisonment, but reprieve, not surrender but strategic retreat, a chance to rest and recover some portion of herself that 3 years of grinding poverty had slowly erased. And as dawn approached with its pale light filtering through her inadequate curtains, she made her decision with the clarity that comes from having exhausted all other options, acknowledging that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and that survival itself required a form of courage her mother would have recognized. Morning found her at her cart earlier than usual, arranging the much-reduced stock that remained after Sebastian's purchase, and when he appeared through the market's stirring crowds, punctual as always, she met his gaze directly and said with all the formal composure she could gather, "I accept your proposal. Your Grace, under conditions I trust you will find reasonable. I ask for mutual respect in all dealings, for the separate chambers you mentioned, and for your word that there will be no pretense between us, no performance of affection we do not feel, no expectations beyond those clearly stated." And she watched something flicker across his features, relief perhaps, or was it disappointment? Some emotion quickly mastered as he nodded once and replied, "Your conditions are entirely acceptable, Lady Isadora, and I give you my word as a gentleman that our arrangement will proceed exactly as outlined, with respect and clarity maintained throughout, and thus with words as formal as a business contract, spoken in a frost-covered marketplace as vendors began their morning songs and the city awakened around them. Isadora Winthrop agreed to become a duchess, sealing a bargain that both believed would remain forever, bound by practicality and reason, neither suspecting that they had just set in motion a transformation that would ultimately reshape not merely their circumstances, but the very foundations of their carefully defended hearts. The journey to Ashford Manor unfolded across 2 days of travel through countryside that grew increasingly wild and beautiful as London's sprawl gave way to rolling hills, touched by winter's first severity. And Isadora sat in Sebastian's luxurious carriage, her simple belongings having been collected and packed by servants she had not met, feeling herself move through landscapes that seemed to belong to a life she had lost 3 years prior, the comfort of cushioned seats and warmed bricks at her feet, a luxury her body had nearly forgotten existed, while Sebastian rode alongside on horseback, maintaining the physical distance that seemed to define their arrangement, speaking with her only during brief stops at coaching inns, where he ensured her comfort with formal courtesy that revealed nothing of the man beneath the title. Ashford Manor revealed itself as they crested a final hill at twilight, and Isadora felt her breath catch despite her determination to remain composed, for the estate spread before her with a grandeur that exceeded even her family's former holdings. grey stone wings embracing manicured gardens, windows blazing with light, columns and balustrades, speaking of generations of accumulated wealth and power, and she understood with sudden clarity that she was entering not merely a house, but a world with its own hierarchies and histories, a world that would regard her with suspicion, regardless of the ring Sebastian had placed upon her finger during their brief, coldly civil ceremony in a London chapel 3 days prior. The staff assembled in the entrance hall to meet their new Duchess, and Isadora read their judgment in carefully neutral expressions, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton's assessing gaze, the butler's slight hesitation before bowing, the younger maid's whispered exchanges barely concealed, and she knew they were measuring her against Sebastian's mother, against expectations of what a duchess should be, finding her wanting in the essential requirement of having been chosen for love rather than convenience. Yet she met their inspection with the grace her mother had trained into her very bones, acknowledging each introduction with appropriate warmth while maintaining the dignity her position required. Her chambers proved both magnificent and isolating, a suite of rooms decorated in pale blues and silver, furniture of such quality that her hands trembled slightly as she touched the silk counterpane, windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward woodland in the gathering darkness, and a maid, young, nervous, helped her unpack her pathetically few belongings into wardrobes and drawers, designed for a wardrobe 10 times the size, the girl's pity barely concealed as she arranged Isadora's threadbare dresses beside the new garments. Sebastian had ordered made beautiful things in rich fabrics that Isadora had not yet brought herself to wear, feeling they belonged to a role she was performing rather than a life she inhabited. Dinner that first evening unfolded in a dining room of oppressive formality, just herself and Sebastian at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 20, courses arriving and departing in silence, broken only by the most necessary exchanges about travel, fatigue, and household arrangements. And as footmen served food of a richness her shrunken stomach could barely manage, Sebastian outlined the expectations of her position with the precision of a general briefing, his officer social calls she would need to make, entertainments she would be expected to host, charitable committees appropriate for a duchess's involvement, standards of dress and deportment required for someone bearing his family's name, and Isadora listened with perfect attention, committing every detail to memory, responding with calm assurance that she understood and would fulfill each obligation, while internally she felt the weight of her bargain settling fully upon her, the understanding that she had exchanged one form of survival for another, trading the physical hardship of poverty for the emotional isolation of this vast, cold house. And when Sebastian finally dismissed her with formal politeness, expressing hope that she would rest well in her new home, she walked through corridors lit by candles in silver sconces, climbed stairs carpeted in deep burgundy, entered her beautiful prison of a suite, and made a silent vow to herself that she would perform this role with such perfection that no one, least of all the distant, unreadable man, who was now her husband, would ever glimpse the loneliness that had followed her from London's frozen marketplace to this palace of marble and regret. The days that followed took on a rhythm of careful observation, as Isadora moved through Ashford Manor like an anthropologist, studying unfamiliar territory, noting how the household functioned with the precision of a military operation, Mrs. Pemberton directing maids and footmen with subtle gestures, the butler maintaining standards that would have satisfied royalty, and beneath the surface efficiency ran currents of loyalty to Sebastian and wariness toward herself. The interloper who had arrived without warning to claim a position for which she had not been vetted by the usual mechanisms of aristocratic approval, and into this delicate ecosystem arrived Lady Caroline Blackwood on the 5th morning of Isadora's residence. Sebastian's younger sister, sweeping into the breakfast room with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Her beauty sharp where Isadora's was soft, her assessment immediate and unfavorable as her grey eyes, so like her brother's travelled over Isadora's carefully chosen morning dress, and found it wanting in some indefinable way that her cool greeting made perfectly clear. "So you are the flower seller my brother has installed as Duchess. How very democratic of him. I do hope you are not overwhelmed by the responsibilities of a position that others spend their entire lives preparing to assume." Isadora felt the cut as it was intended, but years of maintaining dignity through her father's disgrace had taught her to absorb such blows without flinching, and she met Caroline's gaze with calm directness and replied, "I am grateful for your brother's confidence in my abilities, Lady Caroline, and I assure you I take my responsibilities most seriously. Perhaps you might advise me on the local families I should call upon, as I understand you are familiar with the neighborhood," turning the attack into a request that politeness required Caroline to fulfill, and she saw surprise flicker across the younger woman's features before the mask of aristocratic disdain returned, though something in Caroline's subsequent conversation suggested a reluctant respect for someone who would not be easily intimidated. The true test arrived 3 days later, when Sebastian informed her at breakfast, their only shared meal, taken in awkward near silence, that they would be hosting a small dinner party, 12 guests, local gentry, and a baron with his wife. Nothing overwhelming but sufficient to introduce the new Duchess to society, and Isadora felt her stomach tighten with nervousness she dared not show, knowing that her performance at this event would determine how the surrounding families received her, whether they would accept Sebastian's choice or quietly mock it in their drawing rooms, and she spent the intervening days in careful preparation, consulting with Mrs. Pemberton on menus and precedents, reviewing her knowledge of current affairs and local concerns, selecting her dress with strategic care, not the new gowns Sebastian had provided, which might seem pretentious, but her one remaining evening dress from her former life, altered and refreshed, speaking of genteel poverty rather than purchased position. The evening itself unfolded with the heightened awareness of a soldier entering battle, guests arriving in their carriages, Isadora standing beside Sebastian in the entrance hall to receive them, feeling his solid presence at her side, even as the distance between them remained carefully maintained. And as she greeted Lord and Lady Hartwick, Sir James and his daughter, the Baron and Baroness, others whose names she committed to memory with desperate focus, she felt her old training rising through years of dormancy, the skills her mother had instilled returning as if they had merely been waiting for the proper stage, and she moved through the evening's choreography with a grace that was not performance but reclamation, drawing out the shy Miss Hartwick on her watercolors, asking Lady Winters about her renowned gardens, listening with genuine interest to the Baron's concerns about tenant welfare, and across the dinner table's candlelight, she felt, rather than saw, Sebastian watching her, his dark eyes holding an expression she could not quite read, something that might have been surprise or approval, or perhaps merely relief that she was not embarrassing him, and in that moment, when their gazes met and held for 3 heartbeats longer than necessary, she saw the first small crack in the armor he maintained so carefully, a glimpse of the man beneath the Duke, and though neither acknowledged it with word or gesture, something shifted in the space between them, a recognition that perhaps this arrangement might hold possibilities neither had dared to imagine when they struck their pragmatic bargain in a frozen marketplace that already seemed a lifetime away. In the weeks that followed the dinner party, a strange pattern of parallel solitudes emerged within Ashford Manor's elegant walls, 2 people occupying the same grand house yet moving through separate spheres of loneliness that occasionally intersected at formal meals and necessary consultations, and Sebastian found himself increasingly drawn to his study window in the late afternoons, standing with untouched correspondence before him, while his gaze tracked Isadora's figure moving through the gardens below, watching as she explored the grounds with systematic thoroughness, pausing to examine the architecture of the rose arbor that would bloom gloriously in spring. Speaking with the head gardener about winter preparations, her posture conveying an interest that seemed genuine rather than performative, and he found himself wondering what thoughts occupied her mind during these solitary walks, whether she felt the same peculiar ache he experienced when they parted after dinner each evening, returning to their separate chambers with polite wishes for restful sleep, the distance between their rooms a physical manifestation of the chasm he had insisted upon constructing, and he recognized with uncomfortable clarity that he was a coward, that he had brought her into his home under the pretense of practical arrangement, when in truth he had wanted her near in the only way his fear would permit, and close enough to observe, but distant enough to remain protected from the vulnerability that terrified him more than any business negotiation or social challenge ever had. Isadora, walking the frost-touched grounds as November deepened toward winter's true arrival, felt the estate's beauty like an exquisite torture, for she was surrounded by comfort and security, yet starving for a different sustenance entirely. And she caught herself wondering about the man who had given her all of this material abundance, while withholding the one thing that would have transformed these magnificent rooms into a true home. And sometimes when she passed the windows of his study, she felt his gaze upon her like a physical touch, would glance up to see his silhouette framed in lamplight before he stepped back into shadow, and she wondered what he thought in those moments, whether he felt any fraction of the longing that had begun to grow in her chest, despite her determination to honor their agreement's emotional boundaries, whether beneath his controlled exterior lived a man capable of the warmth she sometimes glimpsed in unguarded moments, and she reminded herself sternly that such speculation was both foolish and dangerous, that she had accepted this arrangement with clear understanding of its limitations, yet her heart seemed unwilling to maintain the discipline her mind counseled, and she found herself arranging flowers for his study, though he had not requested such attention, selecting books from the library she thought might interest him and leaving them in his path, small gestures that he never acknowledged but which she noticed he accepted, the flowers always carefully maintained, the books eventually returning with markers suggesting they had been read. The servants, observing these parallel orbits with the keen perception of those who spend their lives reading the moods of their employers, began to soften toward Isadora as her essential kindness revealed itself in daily interactions, and Mrs. Pemberton particularly found herself revising initial judgments as she witnessed the new Duchess learning every servant's name, inquiring after their families with genuine interest, never making unreasonable demands, treating even the youngest scullery maid with a respect that the old Duchess had reserved only for upper servants, and one afternoon over tea in the housekeeper's sitting room, Mrs. Pemberton confided to Isadora the household's rhythms and histories, the late Duchess's warmth that had made Ashford a true home before illness took her, Sebastian's withdrawal into coldness after her death and his father's subsequent cruelty, and Isadora listened with the dawning understanding that the man upstairs in his study was himself imprisoned, not by poverty or social ruin, but by grief and fear. And this knowledge settled into her heart like a key finding its lock, and though she did not yet know how to use it, she recognized that whatever grew between herself and Sebastian would require a patience and courage equal to what she had needed to survive London's frozen streets, a different kind of endurance but perhaps no less demanding. And as evening fell, and she prepared for another formal dinner across that vast table's distance, she felt something shifting in her resolve, a quiet determination that this beautiful, lonely house might yet become something more than a magnificent prison for two people, too wounded to risk the very connection they both secretly craved. The crisis arrived with winter's first true cold, sweeping through the village with the merciless efficiency of all such visitations upon the poor, and word reached the manor through the head gardener, whose sister lived among the estate workers' cottages, that fever had taken hold, children burning with illness while their parents struggled to maintain work obligations and tend the sick simultaneously. And Isadora heard this news while consulting with Mrs. Pemberton on household matters, and felt something shift decisively within her, for she had been poor herself so recently, had known the terror of choosing between fuel and food, and without pausing to consider whether this fell within her prescribed duties as Duchess, she immediately began organizing relief, instructing the housekeeper to prepare baskets of provisions, sending footmen to fetch the physician from town, gathering medicines and blankets, and within the hour she had transformed the manor's efficient calm into purposeful activity, servants responding to her quiet authority with an alacrity that would have surprised her had she not been so focused on the urgent work before her. And she did not think to inform Sebastian because he had closeted himself in his study with his man of business, and in truth, she had grown accustomed to acting independently, to making decisions without consultation, as she had done throughout her months of poverty, and by early afternoon she was in the village herself, moving through the cramped cottages with her skirts pinned up and her sleeves rolled back, holding feverish children while their mothers prepared the broths she had brought, wiping small faces with cool cloths, speaking words of comfort in her calm, cultured voice that seemed to carry its own medicine. And she was kneeling beside a carpenter's daughter, coaxing the child to take another sip of willow bark tea, when she felt rather than heard a presence in the doorway and looked up to find Sebastian standing there, still in his riding coat, clearly having come directly upon hearing where she had gone, and on his face was an expression she had never seen before, wonder and something deeper that made her breath catch even as she maintained her focus on the sick child in her arms. He did not speak, did not command her to return to the manor's safety, but instead removed his coat and joined her in the work, following her quiet instructions, carrying water, holding frightened children while the physician examined them, and she watched him cradle a fevered boy with unexpected gentleness, murmuring reassurances, and saw in that moment past the Duke's calculated reserve to something true and unguarded beneath. And as the hours passed and the immediate crisis stabilized, medicines distributed and fears calmed, they found themselves walking back to the manor together through twilight's purple shadows, alone for the first time without formal dinner's structure or household's presence. And the silence between them felt different now, charged with possibility rather than distance. And finally Sebastian spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "You did not hesitate. You simply acted, as if their welfare were as natural a concern as breathing." And she replied softly, "I know what it is to be vulnerable, to need help that may not come. I could not do otherwise." And he stopped walking then, turned to face her in the gathering darkness, and said with quiet intensity, "My mother was like that. She believed those with privilege bore responsibility for those without it. My father called it weakness, punished her for it, and after she died I told myself that caring was indeed weakness, that distance was strength. But watching you today I remembered what I had forgotten, that true strength lies in allowing oneself to care despite the cost." And Isadora felt tears prick her eyes at this first real revelation of the pain that had shaped him, and she said simply, "Caring always costs, but the alternative costs more. It costs our very humanity." And they stood there in the winter, twilight, the manor glowing with lamplight ahead of them, and something fundamental shifted between them, like a locked door finally yielding to persistent pressure, and when they resumed walking their shoulders brushed together, neither moving away from the contact, and this small touch spoke what neither yet dared to say aloud. The months that followed unfolded with the subtle transformation of seasons, autumn deepening toward winter's approach with that peculiar quality of English weather that shifts gradually yet inexorably, and within Ashford Manor's gracious walls, a parallel transformation occurred through gestures so small they might have escaped. Notice had either Sebastian or Isadora been observing from outside their own carefully maintained defenses, but they were living within the change, and therefore felt each shift with the acute sensitivity of those who have learned to navigate by the faintest signals, and Sebastian found himself pausing in the library to consider which volumes might interest her, remembering a comment she had made about medieval histories or her expressed curiosity about agricultural innovation, and these books would appear on the table in her sitting room without explanation or acknowledgement, and Isadora would discover them and feel something warm expand in her chest, and she in turn began arranging flowers in his study. Not the formal displays Mrs. Pemberton ordered for the public rooms, but more intimate compositions, a single perfect rose in a crystal vase on his desk, a handful of late-blooming asters that she knew somehow he would appreciate for their stubborn refusal to yield to approaching winter. And Sebastian would enter his study to find these offerings and stand before them longer than necessary, and neither spoke of these exchanges, as if putting words to them might shatter whatever fragile understanding was being constructed through such silent conversation. And their evening meals stretched longer, the formal distance of those first dinners gradually dissolving, as conversation moved beyond weather and household business to books and ideas, memories of childhood, observations about the world, and sometimes Sebastian would catch himself laughing at something she said, a genuine sound that startled them both, and Isadora discovered that beneath his reserve lived a sharp intelligence and unexpected wit that made her understand how lonely he must have been within his self-imposed isolation. And one afternoon, while visiting the village with continued relief efforts, she learned from the vicar about Sebastian's extensive charitable works, endowments for schools and hospitals, and pension funds for elderly servants, all maintained with such discretion that even the recipients often did not know their benefactor's identity. And this discovery rearranged her understanding of him once more, revealed layers she had not suspected, and that same week, Sebastian, rising before dawn for an early ride, caught sight of movement in the gardens and discovered Isadora walking the frost-silvered paths in the grey light before sunrise, wrapped in a heavy cloak, and he watched from the terrace as she moved through that liminal hour between night and day, and realized with a sharp pang of recognition that she still kept her flower seller's schedule, rising at an hour when most ladies of her station slept peacefully. And this glimpse into her persistent habits from those desperate months touched him profoundly, for it spoke of how deeply experience marked us and how we carry our past selves within our present circumstances. And the next morning he joined her in the garden without explanation, simply appeared at her side in the dawn silence, and they walked together without speaking, their breath clouding in the cold air. And this too became a pattern. This shared witness to the day's beginning, and though they maintained the careful boundaries of their arrangement, sleeping in separate chambers, never touching beyond the formal requirements of social occasions, something was undeniably shifting between them, like ice beginning its spring thaw, slow and inexorable, beautiful and terrifying, in equal measure. The house party descended upon Ashford Manor, with all the weight of social obligation that Sebastian had long understood as part of his role, and the preparations consumed weeks, as Mrs. Pemberton coordinated with Isadora to ensure every detail met the exacting standards required when hosting members of the highest aristocracy, and Isadora felt the old anxiety of her former life return as she reviewed guest lists and seating arrangements, for these were the very people among whom she had once moved as an equal, who had then turned away when scandal tainted her family name. And Sebastian observed her tension during their morning walks, but said nothing, respecting her privacy, even as he wished he possessed the words to offer comfort. And when the guests began arriving in their magnificent carriages, filling the manor with noise and expectation, Isadora stood beside Sebastian in the entrance hall, receiving them with perfect grace, her training reasserting itself despite the years of poverty between then and now, and most guests treated her with cool politeness, accepting her as Sebastian's choice while clearly reserving judgment, until Lady Vivienne Ashcroft arrived in a rustle of emerald silk and barely concealed triumph, for Vivienne had once been considered the most likely candidate for Duchess, her family's connections impeccable, her beauty celebrated, and she had expected Sebastian's proposal before he had instead withdrawn into his fortress of isolation, and now she swept into the manor with her diplomat husband, Sir Percy Ashcroft, trailing behind, and her eyes found Isadora with the precision of a blade finding its target. And over the days that followed, Vivienne deployed her weapons with expert subtlety, never openly rude but consistently undermining, commenting within Isadora's hearing about how charming it was that the Duke valued character over conventional background, inquiring with false concern whether Isadora found managing a household of this scale overwhelming given her recent circumstances, suggesting activities and conversations that emphasized Isadora's absence from society during her time of poverty. And Isadora endured these calculated cruelties with dignity, responding with grace, never allowing her composure to crack. But Sebastian noticed, catalogued each slight with growing anger, and during a dinner where Vivienne had orchestrated the conversation to focus on a particular ball from 2 seasons past, a glittering affair that she knew Isadora could not have attended, emphasizing shared memories from which Isadora was excluded, something in Sebastian's carefully maintained control finally fractured, and he interrupted Vivienne mid-sentence, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the entire table, saying with quiet force that dwelling on the past seemed a peculiar occupation for those who claimed to live well in the present, that he found his wife's experiences had given her a depth of character and understanding of true value that no amount of uninterrupted social success could provide, and that he considered himself extraordinarily fortunate in his choice. And the table fell into shocked silence at this unprecedented public declaration from a man known for emotional restraint, and Isadora's eyes met Sebastian's across the candlelight, and in that moment of connection she saw clearly the protective fury he barely contained, the defense of her that cost him something to make so publicly, and he saw in her expression both gratitude and a quiet strength that needed no defense but accepted his offering nonetheless. And Vivienne's face tightened with humiliated rage as she recognized her defeat, and though the dinner continued with strained politeness, something fundamental had shifted. For Sebastian had claimed Isadora before witnesses as truly his, and neither of them could pretend any longer that their arrangement remained merely practical. The house party's final evening stretched long and exhausting, performance and polite conversation consuming hours, until Isadora felt the weight of maintained composure like a physical burden, and when at last she could escape, she sought refuge in the library, knowing most guests would be retiring or continuing revelries in the drawing rooms, and she entered the darkened space with relief, not bothering to light more than a single lamp, and settled into the leather chair by the cold fireplace with a book she had no intention of reading, simply needing silence and solitude. But she had been there barely 10 minutes when the door opened again and Sebastian entered, stopping short when he saw her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the lamplight's shadows, and something in his expression, exhaustion, frustration, a vulnerability she rarely witnessed, made her gesture to the chair opposite hers in silent invitation, and he crossed to the sideboard without speaking and poured brandy into a crystal glass, then after a moment's hesitation poured a second and brought it to her, and she accepted it, though she rarely drank spirits, understanding somehow that this night called for fortification, and they sat in silence as he took a long drink, his careful control visibly fraying, and finally he spoke, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, saying that he owed her an apology for subjecting her to Vivienne's cruelty, that he had not anticipated the full measure of viciousness some members of society could deploy, and Isadora responded quietly that she had survived worse than Lady Vivienne's barbs, that poverty had taught her which wounds truly mattered. And Sebastian laughed, a harsh sound without humor, and said that she possessed a strength he had never managed to cultivate, that she had faced her devastation with courage while he had merely hidden from his, and perhaps it was the brandy or the late hour or the accumulated tension of days performing for critical audiences. But his defenses crumbled, and he began to speak with raw honesty about his father, the old duke whose charm in public masked calculated cruelty in private, who had wielded love as a weapon and withdrawal of affection as punishment, who had broken his mother slowly over years of marriage until she became a ghost in her own home, and Sebastian described watching this destruction as a child, helpless to prevent it, and making a vow that he would never grant anyone such power over him, never love, and thus never suffer or inflict the pain that love enabled. And Isadora listened without interruption, her heart contracting with recognition and sorrow, and when he fell silent she found herself speaking her own truth, telling him about her father's betrayal, not just of financial trust, but of everything she had believed about family and honor, about her engagement to Lord Edmund Pierce, who had sworn eternal devotion and vanished within a week of her ruination, about the specific agony of discovering that what she had believed was love had been merely performance contingent upon her social value, and she confessed that she had built her own walls, determined never to be so vulnerable again, never to mistake transaction for genuine feeling, and as they spoke, the space between them seemed to contract, charged with shared understanding and something more dangerous, and Sebastian leaned forward, his eyes finding hers in the lamplight, and she saw in his expression a longing that mirrored something awakening in her own chest, and the air grew thick with possibility, and then he reached across the small distance between their chairs, his hand trembling slightly as it approached hers, and she felt every particle of her being drawn toward that connection. But just as their fingers might have touched, Sebastian pulled back sharply, standing abruptly, his face contorting with conflict, and he muttered something about the late hour and propriety, and left the library with swift steps that spoke of flight, and Isadora sat alone in the lamplight, feeling the ghost of that almost touch, like a brand upon her skin, understanding that they had approached some threshold that terrified them both, and knowing with absolute certainty that everything between them had irrevocably changed. The days following the library encounter stretched into a week of careful avoidance, and Sebastian threw himself into business matters with an intensity that kept him away from the manor for long hours, riding to tenant farms and meeting with his steward about matters that could easily have waited. And when he was forced to dine with Isadora, the meals passed in strained silence, broken only by the most formal courtesies, and she watched him retreat behind walls that now seemed higher than before, and the pain of it lodged beneath her ribs like something physical, and for having glimpsed the man beneath the armor, made his renewed distance unbearable. And she wondered with growing desperation whether she possessed the strength to continue this half-life, loving him while he ran from the very connection that might save them both, and she maintained her dignity through sheer force of will, continuing her duties as Duchess with flawless grace. But Mrs. Pemberton noticed the shadows beneath her eyes and the way her smiles no longer reached beyond performance. And one grey afternoon, as November settled its cold grip upon the estate, Lady Caroline arrived unannounced and sweeping into the manor with her characteristic energy, and she took one look at Isadora's careful composure and her brother's notable absence, and understood immediately that some crisis had occurred. And after dinner, when Sebastian retreated to his study as had become his pattern, Caroline followed and closed the door behind her with a decisive click. And though Isadora could not hear the words exchanged, she heard Caroline's raised voice through the heavy oak, and the word "coward" carried clearly. And later Caroline found Isadora in the music room and took her hands with surprising gentleness, and said that some men required battering down of their defenses from both sides, that Sebastian had spent so many years building his fortress that he no longer remembered how to open the gates, and that Isadora should not mistake his fear for lack of feeling. And Isadora felt tears threaten at this kindness, but maintained her composure and thanked Caroline for her concern. And the next morning brought the post, and among the usual correspondence was a letter addressed in a hand Isadora had once known intimately, and her fingers trembled as she broke the seal to find Lord Edmund Pierce's flowery script, expressing his deepest regrets for his past behaviour, claiming that time and maturity had brought him to recognize his terrible mistake, suggesting that perhaps they might meet so he could properly apologize, and the true purpose emerging in the final paragraph, mentioning that he found himself in some financial difficulty and hoped that she, now so fortunately situated, might remember their former attachment with sufficient fondness to offer assistance through her husband's influence. And Isadora felt something cold and clarifying settle over her as she read this transparent manipulation, and she sat for a long moment with the letter in her hands, understanding that this man represented everything she had once believed about love, the falseness of it, the transactional nature hidden beneath pretty words, and yet what she felt for Sebastian was something entirely different, something real and terrifying and worth fighting for. And she made a decision then, sitting alone in her morning room as winter light slanted through the windows, that she would not allow fear, neither Sebastian's nor her own, to destroy what might exist between them. But before she could act upon this resolve, a footman announced that Lord Edmund Pierce had arrived and was awaiting her in the drawing-room, and her blood ran cold with shock that he had presumed to come here uninvited, and she rose with squared shoulders and walked toward a confrontation she had not chosen but would face nonetheless. Isadora entered the drawing-room with her spine straight and her expression carefully composed, and found Lord Edmund Pierce standing by the windows examining the room with an appraising eye that spoke of calculation rather than admiration. And he turned at her entrance with a smile she had once thought charming but now recognized as practiced, and he crossed to her with hands extended, as though they were intimate friends, reuniting after pleasant separation rather than a man who had abandoned her in her darkest hour. And he began speaking before she could frame a greeting, his words tumbling out in rehearsed contrition about how he had behaved abominably, how he had been young and foolish and influenced by his family's concerns about financial prudence, how he had regretted his actions every day since. And Isadora listened with growing coldness as she understood that this performance was merely preamble to his true purpose. And indeed, after several minutes of self-serving apology, he shifted to admiration of her remarkable fortune in securing such an advantageous match. And then, with transparent maneuvering, he mentioned his own recent difficulties, investments that had failed, debts that pressed upon him, and suggested with oily presumption that surely she remembered their deep affection with enough fondness to speak with her husband about some assistance, perhaps a loan or introduction to the Duke's man of business. And Isadora felt rage kindle beneath her careful composure at his audacity in presuming upon connection he himself had severed, and she opened her mouth to deliver a cutting dismissal when the drawing-room door opened with such force that it struck the wall. And Sebastian stood in the doorway with an expression of barely contained fury, and his eyes moved from Isadora to Edmund and back again with dangerous assessment. And Edmund had the poor judgment to speak first, introducing himself with false cheer and making some comment about renewing old acquaintances, and Sebastian crossed the room with predatory grace and positioned himself slightly in front of Isadora in a gesture of protection that was unmistakable, and his voice when he spoke was ice over steel, as he asked by what presumption Lord Pierce had entered his home uninvited, and Edmund's confidence faltered, but he rallied with ill-advised boldness, suggesting that surely the Duchess was pleased to see an old friend, that their past connection gave him certain rights of visitation, and Sebastian's hands clenched into fists at this implication, and Edmund made his fatal error then, laughing with nervous bravado, and saying that surely they all understood the practical nature of advantageous marriages, that he bore no grudge against Isidora for securing her position through whatever means necessary, just as he had once been forced to consider his own financial requirements, and the words hung in the air for one crystalline moment before Sebastian's control shattered completely, and he struck Edmund with a blow that sent the smaller man staggering backward into a side table, and then Sebastian was on him again, hauling him upright by his cravat, and his voice emerged in a growl that Isidora had never heard from him, as he informed Edmund that he had insulted a lady of impeccable honor, that he would leave this house immediately and never approach the Duchess again, and that if Sebastian heard even a whisper of Edmund speaking her name in public, he would destroy him so thoroughly that no respectable house in England would receive him. And he released Edmund with a shove toward the door where 2 footmen had appeared, summoned by the commotion, and Sebastian ordered them to remove Lord Pierce from the property and ensure he never returned, and Edmund fled with what remained of his dignity. And then Sebastian turned to Isidora, with the fury still blazing in his eyes, but transmuting into something else as he looked at her, something raw and exposed and terrifying in its intensity. And she stood frozen, watching him, her heart hammering against her ribs, shaken not by Edmund's presumption but by the passion of Sebastian's defense, by the undeniable evidence that whatever lay between them had moved far beyond the boundaries of their careful arrangement. The silence that followed Edmund's departure stretched between them like something alive and trembling, and Isidora stood rooted to the floor, watching Sebastian's chest heave with the aftermath of violence and passion, and his hands still bore the tension of barely restrained fury. And she found her own anger rising not at Edmund's presumption, but at the man before her, at months of careful distance and walls rebuilt after every moment of connection, and her voice emerged sharp with emotion as she demanded to know what right he had to such rage on her behalf, when he had spent weeks avoiding her very presence. And Sebastian turned to her with eyes still blazing, and said in a voice rough with feeling that he had every right as her husband, and she laughed bitterly at this claiming of husbandly prerogative from a man who had insisted their arrangement remain bloodless and practical, and they stood in the ruins of drawing-room civility, trading words that cut deeper than either intended, accusations about pride and fear and the torture of living half a life, and Sebastian's control finally shattered completely as he crossed to her and seized her shoulders and confessed in a rush of words that he had loved her from the very beginning, that he had seen her in that flower market and recognized her name from the scandal sheets and known her story and been unable to walk away, that every rose he purchased had been an excuse to stand near her for just a moment more, that his careful arrangement had been the act of a coward who wanted her desperately but was too terrified of vulnerability to reach for her honestly. And Isidora stared at him as these words poured forth like a dam breaking, and her anger transmuted into something else as she understood the depth of his deception, and she struck his chest with her palm and demanded to know how he could have been so cruel to bind her to him while maintaining such distance, to make her love him while pretending indifference, and at her words times make her love him, times. Sebastian went utterly still, and his hands gentled on her shoulders as he asked in a voice stripped of all defenses whether she meant what those words implied. And Isidora felt tears burn in her eyes as she confessed that yes, she loved him, that she had fought against it with every particle of her being but had fallen nonetheless, that watching him retreat after the library had been agony, that she could not continue in this half-existence of being his wife in name while remaining strangers in truth. And Sebastian's expression crumbled into something raw and exposed, and he pulled her against him with desperate strength and buried his face in her hair and whispered that he was sorry, so desperately sorry for his cowardice. That fear of becoming like his father or suffering like his mother had made him cruel when he wanted only to love her as she deserved, and Isidora's hands came up to clutch at his coat as months of careful restraint finally broke, and she felt his tears hot against her temple as he held her with trembling intensity, and they stood locked together in the devastated drawing room, while outside winter twilight gathered, and inside something new and fragile and infinitely precious began to take shape between their joined hearts. And when Sebastian finally drew back enough to look at her, his eyes held none of their practiced distance, but only naked love and terrified hope, and Isadora reached up to touch his face with wonder, tracing the evidence of his tears, and whispered that she forgave him, that she understood fear, that perhaps they might begin again with honesty between them. And Sebastian caught her hand and pressed his lips to her palm in wordless gratitude and supplication. Sebastian led her from the drawing room with gentle hands, past the curious eyes of servants who discreetly withdrew, and they climbed the grand staircase in silence that hummed with possibility rather than distance. And when they reached the corridor where their separate chambers lay, they both paused, and Sebastian turned to her with such naked vulnerability in his expression that Isadora's breath caught, and he asked permission to stay with her, not as duty or arrangement, but as husband who loved his wife. And she answered by taking his hand and leading him through her chamber doors, and once inside with the world locked away, he spoke again in a voice rough with emotion, telling her that the morning he purchased every rose had been the morning he could no longer bear, watching her freeze in the dawn, cold selling flowers to survive, that he had gone to that market every day for weeks, working up courage to speak to her beyond mere transaction, that he had known her name and her story and her father's scandal, and none of it had mattered, because he had seen in her something pure and unbreakable. And he confessed that when he redesigned the estate gardens after their marriage, he had planted roses everywhere because their scent reminded him of her, because he wanted to be surrounded by beauty that echoed what he felt but could not say. And Isadora listened with tears streaming down her face as months of careful restraint finally broke open, and she told him that she had loved him despite herself, that she had tried so hard to protect her heart, but he had breached every defense with his small kindnesses, with books left on tables and his presence at breakfast, and the way he listened when she spoke as though her words held value. And Sebastian cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness and kissed away her tears, and then he kissed her mouth with a reverence that made her tremble, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and healing, months of longing finally given permission to emerge, and they came together with fumbling urgency, stripping away not just clothing but every pretense and wall that had kept them separate, and Sebastian worshipped her body with his hands and mouth as though she were something sacred. And Isadora discovered that beneath his practiced coldness lay a man capable of profound tenderness, and their joining was both fierce and gentle, a claiming and a surrender. And afterward they lay tangled together in the darkness, speaking in whispers about fear and hope, and the terrifying courage required to love fully, and Sebastian traced patterns on her skin and told her she was extraordinary, and Isadora wept again, but this time from joy, and they made love again as dawn approached, slower and deeper, learning each other with wonder, and when morning light finally spilled through the windows they faced it together. Sebastian's arms wrapped around Isadora from behind as they stood at the window overlooking the rose gardens he had planted for her, and he pressed his lips to her temple and whispered that this was their true beginning, and Isadora leaned back against him, feeling for the first time since her world collapsed that she had found not just safety but home. And in the golden morning light they stood together transformed, two wounded souls who had found in each other the courage to heal. The weeks that followed their breakthrough moved like a dream, transformed into waking reality, and the first evidence of change appeared in small but unmistakable ways. Sebastian's hand seeking Isadora's beneath the breakfast table, his laughter echoing through corridors that had known only austere silence, the way he looked at her across rooms with such naked affection that servants exchanged knowing glances and smiles. "Mrs. Pemberton remarked to the cook that the Duke seemed 10 years younger. That warmth had returned to Ashford Manor after an absence so long she had forgotten what it felt like. And indeed the very atmosphere of the great house seemed to shift as winter deepened, as though love between its master and mistress had altered something fundamental in the ancient stones. Isadora took to the transformation of their home with purpose born of joy, consulting with Sebastian on every change, and together they opened shuttered rooms and replaced heavy draperies with lighter fabrics and filled vases with hothouse roses, even in the coldest months. And Sebastian watched her work with wonder in his eyes, marveling at how she could take his fortress and make it a home through nothing more than care and attention to beauty. They began working together on the charitable projects that had once been his solitary domain, riding out to tenant farms and village cottages as a united front. And the estate workers, who had initially regarded their duchess with suspicion, now watched her with open affection as she learned their children's names and remembered their concerns, and spoke to Sebastian on their behalf with gentle advocacy he could never refuse. As February arrived with its brief thaws and sudden freezes, Caroline returned for an extended visit and found her brother so thoroughly transformed that she embraced Isadora with tears of gratitude, confessing that she had feared Sebastian lost forever to his self-imposed isolation, and the three of them spent evenings in companionable conversation that felt like family in ways the great house had not known since Sebastian's childhood. When March brought the necessity of a small gathering obligations to neighboring families that could not be postponed, Isadora and Sebastian planned it together, and on the evening of the event, she stood in the ballroom wearing sapphire silk that Sebastian had commissioned for her, and he watched her move among their guests with natural grace and genuine warmth, and his heart swelled with such fierce love and pride that Caroline, observing him, laughed softly and remarked that he looked like a man drunk on happiness rather than wine. There came a moment during that evening when Isadora stood speaking with the vicar's wife about establishing a lending library for the village, animated and engaged, lamplight catching in her dark hair and color high in her cheeks from the warmth of the room and the pleasure of purposeful conversation, and Sebastian experienced a flash of memory. Isadora in the flower market, in tattered silk and falling snow, beautiful and dignified, despite her desperate circumstances, and the contrast between that image and the woman before him, now secure and cherished and radiant with contentment, struck him with almost physical force, and when she glanced up and caught his gaze across the room, she smiled with such intimacy, and knowing that several guests noticed the exchange and whispered about how deeply the Duke and Duchess appeared devoted to one another, and Sebastian crossed to her side, not caring what society might think of his obvious attachment, and took her hand and raised it to his lips in full view of their company, and Isadora's eyes shimmered with unshed tears of joy as she squeezed his fingers in silent communication of everything words could not convey. As April arrived with its gentle promise of renewal, bringing soft rains that coaxed green shoots from winter-hardened earth and filled the air with the scent of growing things, Sebastian proposed a journey that made Isadora's heart catch with painful sweetness, a return to London, to the flower market where their story had truly begun. And though he would not explain his full purpose, she trusted him enough now to simply take his hand and agree. And so on a morning when dew still clung to rose petals, they departed for the city in the ducal carriage. Talking of small things and large as miles passed beneath them, Sebastian's thumb tracing circles on her palm in absent affection that still had the power to make her breath quicken. London greeted them with its familiar cacophony, the streets teeming with life and commerce. But when their carriage drew to a halt, Isadora realized with shock that they had stopped at the precise corner where she had once sold flowers in tattered silk and desperate dignity, and Sebastian helped her down with careful hands and led her to where her old cart had stood. Except now there stood a proper flower stall with a bright awning and sturdy construction, and emerging from behind it came Martha and old Tom and young Annie, her former companions in street selling. But they were dressed in clean, warm clothing, and their faces had lost the gaunt desperation she remembered, and Martha rushed forward with tears streaming to embrace her, and through her own tears, Isadora heard the story that the Duke had purchased the market corner and established a fund, ensuring the flower sellers could operate with dignity and security, that he had arranged proper shelter and fair prices and protection from the harsh elements that had once been their constant enemy. And Isadora turned to Sebastian with such overwhelming emotion that words failed her, and he simply drew her close and whispered against her hair that he could not change her past suffering, but he could honor it by ensuring others need not endure the same. And they spent hours among her old friends who blessed them both and spoke of the Duke's generosity with reverence, and Isadora saw in Sebastian's gesture not just kindness, but a profound understanding of what those desperate months had meant to her, how they had forged her strength even as they had broken her circumstances, and when they finally returned to their lodgings as afternoon light turned golden, she felt such fullness of heart that she thought she might burst with it. And that evening, as they dined privately in their rooms, she took Sebastian's hand and placed it upon her belly, and told him in a voice trembling with joy that she carried his child, that their love had created new life, and Sebastian's face transformed with such wonder and fierce tenderness that she saw the last shadow of the cold, distant Duke finally dissolve forever, replaced entirely by the man she loved, and he knelt before her chair and pressed his forehead to her stomach, and wept tears he had perhaps not shed since childhood. And Isadora cradled his head against her and felt the perfect rightness of this moment, spring bringing promise of new life to them as it brought renewal to the world, their transformation complete, their future unfolding like petals opening to sunlight.